All right, everyone. I hope everybody had a good break and everybody can hear me. And we will move on to answer some questions. So, for those of you who just joined, my name is Julie Zaklis-Antow, and I lead the accessibility work at the Information Technology Industry Council, who is putting on this presentation and training today. Without any further ado, we're going to move on to some of the questions we received. And this is actually one we receive a lot through emails. And if you do have any questions, feel free to email us later too. But there's always a lot of questions in terms of the timing of filling out VPAT. How much time does one take to do so? How much time does one need? So, Mary Jo, I was wondering if you could give us some insight into that.
I'm sorry, I was looking at the thing. What was the question again?
How much time does one need, slash, how much time does one need to set aside to fill out the VPAT? How long does that normally take?
Yes, so that all depends on a number of factors. The size and complexity of your product, and what it includes. Does it have hardware, software, documentation? Is there a web-based software or website, and support services? Um, and so you have to consider whether you've already performed your accessibility testing on all these aspects of your product and service. If not, you need to do the testing first before you even attempt to fill out the VPAT. And that might take you a bit of time to actually test. So the more full-featured the product, the more testing and assimilation of the test results have to happen, to make sure that there's a clear and accurate picture of the accessibility conformance, to the requirements. So once the test results are understood, you know what the accessibility issues are and what will not be addressed before you release your product, you can fill out your VPAT. And so, filling out the actual form is probably the simplest and quickest part of that whole process.
Thank you so much, Mary Jo. I really appreciate it. Question for Steve. If I need to report on two different standards, such as 508 and EN 301549, do I need multiple VPATs? How would I go about that?
Uh, so you shouldn't really need them. You might have a request, like a specific request from someone to say, please give us if they're looking for something for the revised Section 508 standard, they might ask, please submit a 508 edition VPAT. In my experience, an INT edition, which includes the 508 conformance information, would always really be accepted in that because it has all of the criteria that are included in the 508. And actually, some places might actually prefer that because it also lets them see how their product conforms to, the WCAG 2.1 or WCAG 2.2 template standards as well. So there might be cases where you might be specifically asked for an addition, but you could always reach out to them and say, we have all of this conformance reported in the INT edition of the template. Is that okay? And in my experience, that's always been acceptable.
Thanks, Steve. That's great. Mary Jo, this one's for you, and it's on a similar vein. We have someone here who works at the state government level, and they're asking if they should use WCAG or Section 508 versions of the VPAT since the product is only for state residents.
Well, it all depends upon your state policy because actually most states have an accessibility policy, as well as what you're trying to meet. If you're doing procurement of a variety of technology, including hardware, 508 is probably a appropriate standard to use for that. But if you're just worrying about the accessibility of websites and things like that for the government, um, a an ACR on WCAG would probably be more appropriate. So it all just depends on what your state requires, which I don't know what state it is, and I don't know all of the state policies offhand, but you do have to just kind of base that on what you are required to meet.
Thanks. And this one's for either one, whoever wants to answer. We got a couple of questions asking for a good rubric for deciding between partially supports or does not support, or any metrics or measurement standards or terms that could be used for supports, does not support, and partially supports. I was wondering if the two of you could jump in and give us a little more clarity on that.
So it is a tricky question. It's somewhat interpretation, right, of what you want to say. But to me, whether you're choosing does not support or partially supports, I think a lot of it you have to consider what is the effect on the user? Can they not use the technology at all? Are they completely blocked from major functionality? I would say does not support, right? It partially supports is more towards the vein of we have really tried to make accessibility, a focus. We're working on it. We have made great strides in making the product accessible. And yeah, we have some issues and we can document them. And especially if there's workarounds and things like that, document them. I think the documentation of what your problems are, how it affects the user, and if there's any workarounds is super important. That kind of qualifies what answer you give.
Yeah, I think just to second that, I think it's important to just kind of remember um, what is the purpose of these reports? The purpose is for purchasers to be able to make an informed decision on the accessibility of a product for their users. So, with that sort of context in mind, I think that can really help determine between some of these categories on if functionality is not available at all to users because of accessibility issues, then you need to factor that into your report.
Awesome. Mary Jo, are the WCAG accessibility standards and guidelines consistent across web and mobile OS?
So this is kind of an interesting question because um, I would have to say that WCAG, not in 508, their application of WCAG, they actually have exceptions for some of the criteria, and the same for the EN 301549. So when it's mobile native, which is non-web version of your software, mobile software. So for those, some of those criteria won't necessarily be applied, but the rest of the WCAG standards pretty much apply consistently and in there. So I think that's about the best answer I can give.
Thank you. Now, Steve, this one's for you. Regarding third-party product testing, how can we tell if a user can determine whether a third-party integration is a separate product or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. And sometimes it can be really tricky. I think to kind of give a more obvious example, if I think when I brought this up in the presentation, I was using maybe an example of like the checkout process of an online marketplace. If if you have like an integration with a third-party payment platform or something like that, but all of that process is completed within your user interface, and generally it is maybe a specific button or a confirmation window, then you should be reporting on that. You should be testing it, reporting it, because it still is your interface that's using it. But if you are completing a checkout process and it actually, let's say, opens up a new window to a third-party payment platform website, that could change a week after you have implemented that into your product, and you have absolutely no control over the accessibility or the markup of that, then it makes more sense to ask them for an accessibility conformance report and update your report with a link to where they can find the latest version of that report. In some cases, this might be a little bit more tricky, but generally, my recommendation is that if it's something that your product team has some control over, and you are able to address any of those accessibility issues, that should be reported within your within your product.
Thanks, Steve. I really appreciate it. And hopefully whoever submitted that question does too. Mary Jo, since you have incredible experience with WCAG, one of the questions submitted asks, who will decide which WCAG version and level to follow and on what basis?
So once again, this is up to, it depends on which side of the fence you're on. If you're procuring, it's all in the policy that you're trying to meet. And so you'll require in your request for bids, whatever WCAG version is required in your region, I would imagine, that you're trying to meet. And if you are a product team, it depends on where you're offering your product, who you're offering your product to. So you need to investigate what is required and what is being used. My biggest recommendation is typically level AA of whatever WCAG version you do choose to use, because most regulations worldwide only require up to level AA. So that means including all the level A and AA criteria.
Thanks, Mary Jo. Something also for you, in terms of the remarks and explanations section, is it appropriate to say that the criteria partially supports and that the product team is currently working to make the product more accessible in the future?
Well, I guess that depends. On the current level of testing and support that you have. If you have made strides in making things accessible and there's not like complete blockers to someone with a disability using whatever it is you're creating, whether it's a website or an application or whatever technology it is. But you can put in your remarks and explanations or in your notes somewhere that say, or in, with a bid, that we do care about accessibility. You could, if it's a website, you could make an accessibility statement and say, hey, we are working towards making this website accessible. This is the standard we want to work towards. You don't necessarily have to give a date, but yes, it's a priority and it is a focus for us. And so if you're transparent about that, it's more helpful.
Thank you. And for either of you, if the same accessibility issue appears on multiple pages, how should one go about mentioning that explanation? Would it be mentioning it once? Would it be mentioning throughout it? And would it need to require a creation of a new VPAT for each page, or is one document enough for an entire website?
I can start with this. So, I mean, keep in mind the VPAT is the voluntary product accessibility template. So it's not a voluntary page accessibility template, or else procurement people would probably have nightmares about how many they would need to review to determine how accessible a product is. So I would say that the Accessibility Conformance Report using the VPAT should be representative of the product's accessibility and the parts of the product that will be used. So as we mentioned in the presentation, that includes, for example, for a website, it would include not only the website, but also product documentation and support services and things that your users would actually be able to use and interact with and consume.
Thank you so much, Steve. And this question actually came up twice, so I'm consolidating two questions. This one is also for you, Steve. If this person is a reseller or creating an ACR on behalf of a client, should the contact section show the client's email or whoever is completing it? Or should the product's manufacturer? Who would be responsible for that?
So I'm curious if Mary Jo has a different take on this, but there's a distinction that I'd like to draw between who is responsible for the accessibility of the product and who is a contact information in a situation of, let's say, a reseller. And as a reseller, you typically would not have the ability to directly change or fix accessibility issues in the product. So if that is the case, then if you were a reseller and you were providing the accessibility conformance reports that were provided by the manufacturer, those reports would have the accessibility contact information of the manufacturer. I haven't been in this situation too many times myself, so I think that in a situation like this, I would just imagine that the end purchaser, would have that contact information of the reseller. But in that situation, I would also assume that they would be able to contact the original manufacturer for more information with the accessibility issues in the report.
Yeah, I don't have anything different to add to that. Honestly, if whoever's manufacturing it is best equipped to test and report on the accessibility of their product, and then pass that information on to any reseller so that they can either incorporate it or, provide it separately. When they're reselling like a bundle of whole bunch of products, they can provide the ACRs for all of them. And then all of that information is correct by the manufacturer. I don't think a reseller should have to test all of that unless they're making major modifications or additions. Then that part they would have to test and report on.
Thank you so much, the two of you. And another question we received in a similar vein on completing the VPAT. We know that there are several companies out there advertising services to complete the VPAT. Do you need to use one of those services, or can VPATs be completed by whoever?
Well, if your company has a really good understanding of accessibility and they've done the work to make the product accessible and they also know how to test for it, then, completing it, doing all the testing, and completing the VPAT and creating an ACR yourself is perfectly fine. Otherwise, there are consulting companies that can help you get educated, do the testing for you, and some of them actually will fill out an ACR for you, and that may be a quicker route. But it comes at a cost, so you have to weigh time versus cost, and whether or not your team has the chops to do all of that accessibility work and test and reporting.
Yeah, and I'd just maybe add on that ultimately it is the product manufacturer's responsibility for the accuracy of the report as well. So ultimately, that all falls on the product vendor for that. So if they are getting a third party to test their products, you can kind of, I guess, come to whatever determination you want on that. There is something to be said about what Mary Jo had mentioned. If you are completing these reports in-house, then at least you are aware of all of the issues that are present in the report, and that your team is aware of them, and that you have at least a certain level of accessibility knowledge to be able to identify them and hopefully resolve them. But I wouldn't necessarily put it's definitely not required to use a third-party company for it. But if you do not have that type of expertise in your company and it's not something that you're able to take on, then those companies can be helpful in navigating through that process.
Thanks. And Steve, another question for you on making decisions about the VPAT. The question came in asking about Section 508 and 301549 and adding them in a single table. Does it depend on which organization, or is there such a table that they can combine for A, AA, and AAA?
So I wouldn't recommend combining like, let's say, the revised Section 508 standard and the EN table together. I think that's kind of maybe potentially missing the point on who is going to be reading these. In a lot of situations, the person reading the accessibility conformance report will be looking to determine in a procurement process, how well does this product fit the requirements of our organization or government or something like that. And I don't know offhand of anyone who actually has a requirement for both EN 301549 and revised section 508. So if you were to combine those into a single table, that is putting a lot of burden on some procurement professionals who likely don't necessarily even, like in many cases, might not even really understand the significance of accessibility criteria. And as I mentioned in the presentation, a lot of the time these are used to compare products against each other. And I think that it's probably in everyone's best interest to try to make, the one of the great value, one of the greatest values of using the VPAT is that you're providing a standardized template that makes it easier to compare products as part of this. So if you're going to radically change it in a way that makes it more difficult for people to be able to compare that, it's probably not the best idea for you participating in that process.
Thanks, Steve. Super helpful. And if you're responding to a government solicitation that doesn't specify which VPAT to use, what should they do?
Well, it depends on what government, right? And what standards are being required in that government. So really it all boils down to what's the jurisdiction, right? What are their regulated standards that they are required to adhere to? And that gives you a clue into what VPAT edition to use, and what level, what versions of the standards to use. But as we said earlier in the presentation, when in doubt, use the int version, report to everything, and then that will widen your customer base. Now, if you're in a particular government and trying to do this, then you'll know what standards you're supposed to be meeting.
And Mary Jo, since I have you right here, this one's also for you. The U.S. Access Board outlines the WCAG mapping to the FPCs. How can this be used in place of filling out the 508 tables?
Well, I would say no, because of the fact that in 508, the functional performance criteria are actually stated to be used in two cases. One is if you're claiming equivalent facilitation, because you can't meet the standard as required, but you have some other way to do it, or if the 508 standards don't cover the type aspects of your technology, like it doesn't even have accessibility requirements for certain aspects of your technology. It was kind of a way to future-proof 508 for all these technologies that keep marching on, and standards take a while to catch up sometimes. So I would say do not use the FPC instead of the 508 tables. Use the 508 tables, please.
Thanks, Mary Jo. One is for the both of you, but should VPATs be completed for products and websites that are free and available to all users who don't need to follow the procurement process? For example, if a tool is provided by a government agency for public use, is a VPAT needed? Mary Jo, I see you thinking.
I'm thinking, definitively, I'm not sure I can answer that, but I would say probably not. If it's just something that's freely available, it doesn't mean that you don't have to meet standards if you're providing it to the public, right? But it doesn't mean that you have to actually fill out a VPAT, but you would probably want to, in some way, make sure that it's accessible, make sure that internally, whoever is producing this has an idea of the accessibility status of this thing, and they might need to provide some additional support or some things so that if someone has accessibility issues that they can report it. making an accessibility statement. I've seen those around. Accessibility statements are a good way to, show that that you want to do accessibility, that it's important to you. You can say what standards you want to meet. There's all kinds of information, ways for people to submit issues. And then that's helpful to the users, especially if it's publicly available, that they can get some support if needed.
Yeah, I also think that there's maybe an area that we can't directly speak to, which is maybe the compliance aspect of this, which is what is required. What are the requirements of documents or websites or products that the government provides to people? There might be some requirements there where, yes, they would actually need to test and make sure that those meet a certain benchmark of accessibility. That could vary, depending on where you are in the world. So since we can't really answer that, assuming that that's not the case, the answer is probably not. But at the same time, you might want to, there still could be value in disclosing this. A lot of the time, products that are freely available will provide ACRs based on VPAT to the public and make them publicly available. So users that that read them can have a better understanding of where some potential barriers might be in their usage of it.
Thanks, Steve. Mary Jo, how often should one be updating the ACR, and under what circumstances, in terms of changes to products, would require an ACR update?
Wow, I think we covered this a little bit in the presentation earlier, but just to kind of reiterate, updating your ACRs would have to, it would depend on like what type of product it is. If it's hardware, obviously hardware doesn't change that often. So, only when your hardware gets updated should you need it.
Steve,
I'm
do you
sorry.
want,
I think Steve's gonna have to.
Steve, do you want to jump in?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, absolutely. How often should one be updating their ACR, and under what circumstances warrant that a product require an ACR update?
I think like my general answer to this is usually when the accessibility of the product has changed. Um, so I know that this can be a bit different depending on the type of product, as Mary Jo did mention there. But yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, anytime that you fix an accessibility issue in your product, you should be able to update that. And if you can move a criterion from partially supports to supports, like why not update that, and why not show that you are actively working on this. I think one thing I didn't necessarily mention when during the presentation, when like how to read an ACR, we did talk a little bit about things like semantic versioning, and when that's not really available, like on a lot of web products, you can use the date of the report. And if you see that the date of the report is extremely recent, that can really help give you more confidence that this report is more representative of like the product that is currently being used than a report that might be a year old. So if you are making fixes to your product that will impact the accessibility of the product, I would recommend updating it as frequently as you can. And this, unfortunately, also goes the other way. If you are introducing new accessibility issues, it's important for people to, be able to find that represented in the report. But I understand in some cases that's not always possible, but that would be my recommendation.
Thank you. And in a similar vein, we have a question about how often owners should be updating their testing against WCAG standards. Was wondering if you could give us a little bit of insight.
For me, I think that you should be testing accessibility throughout, the entire process. We were, I think early in this presentation, we talked about this a little bit, but the whole process of filling out a VPAT is a lot easier and faster and eliminates a lot of surprises if you are testing and planning for accessibility as early in that process as possible. So if you don't want to get to a point where you don't do any accessibility testing until you're about to release and then find out that you have a lot of barriers and you'll have, a lot of does not support in your ACR. And, you're only catching that at a time where you're about to release it. And, in some cases that, it's still valuable to release it, but, you don't want to have to be dealing with these issues that far down the line. So I would recommend integrating accessibility testing into each stage of your product development process.
Including design. So even there are certain aspects of WCAG that can be addressed in your designs. So, it's important to, start thinking about it early and throughout the process. There's certain aspects that are, responsibilities of coders, but yeah, if you split the responsibilities, it's not all in one person. You can address things as early as you can, and will typically wind up with a much more accessible result. And then if you're trying to update to new standards, you'll have to decide, when you want to make that cutover to support new standards, find out what the new requirements are and impact on your product, and then begin to incorporate those requirements and testing into your processes through the design and dev and testing phases of whatever you're working on.
And Mary Jo, you mentioned multiple phases of testing and phases, and we have a question here of how important is it for an evaluation to be done by an unbiased professional third party?
It can be quite helpful to have a third party, but I mean, there are also caveats. If you've got a pretty complex product, they might not have an understanding of how it works and what the functionality is. So I think you would have to kind of partner. If you wanted a professional to do some testing, you have to partner with them and make sure that they understand the user flows and tasks that can be done and how that happens and what aspects need to be tested. So I guess that's my answer to that. And we answered previously questions about, do you have to have third-party testing? No, you don't necessarily have to. Within IBM, there's actually a combination. We have so many products in IBM. Um, some teams, they don't have the accessibility chops and they know it, or they don't have the time to do all the accessibility testing. So they'll hire either outside of IBM or within IBM. We have a team that does accessibility testing. And so they'll ship it off to them and they work together to get the product tested. So it all depends on, your budget, your time, your capabilities. So it varies.
Thank you for that complete answer. We actually had another question about who typically fills out a VPAT, so I feel like that's a perfect way to answer that too. This is one of, I'm sure, the three of ours favorite questions to receive, and I know I get it all the time, asking if ITI or somebody else can certify a VPAT or if there is a VPAT certification, and if so, how one can get their product certified. So, what is your answer to that, Mary Jo?
There is no certification. And we said that on one of the slides. I just want to reiterate, some people might advertise that they certify. It's not like UL certification for electrical safety, right? You have to have, somebody experienced in testing for accessibility, for sure, testing your thing. And they do test to make sure as much as possible your product conforms to the accessibility standards. And so just knowing that you can test to conformance to the best of your ability, and certification is not a thing.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Mary.
if I can add on to that, it's just like certification just doesn't make sense in products that can be updated dozens of times in a single day. Because as I mentioned before, with like how often should you be doing WCAG testing? Well, in some cases, like the testing, if you let's say you have a website that receives dozens of updates in a day, or even a handful of them, ideally you're doing WCAG testing of those before they're released. And anytime that you would have a change to that, that would seemingly invalidate any certification. Like that's just not really a feasible thing, unlike some other types of product certifications that have, things that don't change. If you're releasing something that is going to be stable and have no changes over a 2-year period, maybe in a situation like that, you could develop some sort of certification system, but it just doesn't really apply for most of the types of situations that a VPAT would be involved in.
Thanks, Steve. And I know you talked about best practices and filling out the VPAT. And we got one question here asking, what is the best way to describe the scope of the evaluation? And they gave a particular example. So, for example, to explain which samples were tested to produce the results, was wondering if you could give us a little bit of insight here.
Yeah. So if you use an established evaluation system like the WCAG EM, the WCAG evaluation methodology, as an example, you can provide a link to the WCAG EM page and say we used the WCAG evaluation. I've had reports before where we would provide a lot of detail and say we selected 35 representative samples of a website, and we also had a dozen random samples, and that is how we tested this report, and the results of this report are reflective of these samples. If you don't have that, then I would just encourage you to provide as much detail as you can about how you scoped the testing, because really keep in mind how this is going to be received. If you have a product that is extremely complex and has lots of different pages and templates, or lots of different components and functionality, but you only list a homepage as being tested, then the person that's reading it is going to think, okay, well, this actually doesn't seem to really fit the needs of the functionality that we are looking for. So I need to evaluate products where the functionality that I need is actually represented in the report. I hope that answers it.
I think it does. Thank you so much, Steve. Now I'm just going to take a couple of seconds to talk to you all. And I know we've been kind of hinting at this throughout the presentation and basically talking about this, but we do have a new VPAT 2.5 Rev that is already live on our website. And I would love to turn it over to Mary Jo to really answer what is new in VPAT 2.5 Rev and why should we or why should anybody use it?
Okay, so VPAT 2.5 Rev, we got some feedback from users of how they were a little confused about things like the evaluation methods used, and they were getting some ACRs that were just copying some basic information from our instructions as their answer to evaluation methods used. So we made improvements saying, you really need to give some details, a little bit more information. Don't copy what's here, kind of thing, because evaluators want to actually know what processes or what methods you've used to test. Does it include users with disability? Whatever you can provide as far as how you tested, it helps them to understand, do you really understand, whoever tested it really understand accessibility? Do they really understand the requirements, and do they have a process, and are they using an established process for testing? There are some out there. And so you document that. Some of the other things were really purely editorial. We just had some editorial changes. There was some changes in the tables, a few anomalies that occurred in the tables. No change in requirements, none, no new standards, nothing like that. It's all purely editorial changes within the template part of it itself in the tables. And so you can pick that up and then you can get the latest update. It's not any change from the VPAT 2.5 requirements though. So just putting that out there. The next update will be a full point, probably a point release when we do the EN 301549, which we'll finish at some point this year, I hope.
And if one were wanting to see, for example, all the changes in one place, is there a
Oh,
document that
yes.
would?
Yeah. I forgot to mention that. Yes, we do have like a change log that's available on the ITI website. So it's a file and we mark down it for every change to the VPAT version. We put in what's changed for each edition. And so you can peruse that and see what has changed there.
Amazing. And we're almost at time. So I have one last, but certainly not least question for you, Mary Jo.
Sure.
Where does someone go to get more information on the VPAT or to find a recording of this presentation and the slides that were presented here today?
Yes. The that is available from the ITI website. They have a VPAT page, www.itic.org/policy/accessibility/VPAT. And once you're on that page, you can also see there's a link to the training. So that's on a separate page, but it's all available initially from that VPAT page. You can get the VPAT 2.5 Rev. You can see the change log. All that stuff is all there and available to you.
And I just got a last question wanting to know from Steve where they can get an Art I Heart WCAG pin because they love it. So,
Yeah, I'm wearing a yellow I Heart WCAG pin. I believe I got this at a accessibility event in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, many years ago. So a shout out to my local A11YTO meetup group and conferences. I believe this might have come from, I think it might have been the government of Ontario setting up a booth there. And because I also had a My Ontario is Accessible pin, but I couldn't find that one today. But I don't know where to get these now. Actually, it says on it ontario.ca/accesson. So it was from the Ontario government. So shout out to my provincial government.
and your final reminder to love WCAG, EN 301549, Section 508, and everything, all the standards related to accessibility. But on a more personal note, and what I love and what I would like to thank on behalf of ITI, a huge thanks to Steve and Mary Jo for their countless hours of dedication. This is a labor of over 6 months of work. So thank you so much for the two of you and the entire committee for everything you all have put forth. Thank you to each and every one of you for attending and sticking around for this almost 2 hour long training, which, as we did say, as Mary Jo did say, will be available as a recording on our website alongside VPAT 2.5 Rev and the slides that were presented here today. My contact information is also at the bottom of that website, which we will send in a link to you after this webinar is done. So please, if you have any and all remaining questions, we will be keeping all the questions that were submitted and we'll be likely compiling them either into a Q&A or a separate document. So thank you so much for sending all of those in. Thank you so much for spending so much time with us today. And I hope to see you all next time because we will have, as Mary Jo said, we will definitely have some more updates in the next year. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your week. Thank you. Bye-bye.